Hello, YouTube. Sidekick here in my trusty A10 with another installment of The Balloon Goes Up, recreating the Cold War battlefield in DCS. Before we get into this video, though, I do want to take a minute and talk about why I'm making the series, because I did get some comments that I think maybe misunderstand the point. I'm not really making this series to argue about the outcome of a confrontation, if it had happened, between the Warsaw Pact and NATO. I'm really just trying to create a plausible and playable, meaning a challenging and entertaining scenario in DCS, one that puts the original A-10 into the environment for which it was designed. Given that it's one of the iconic aircraft around which the DCS franchise was kind of built, I think that's worth spending some time on. Now, if you think the circumstances that I'm describing are wildly improbable or even impossible, you no doubt have good reasons to believe that, and I'll defer to your greater command of the subject matter, and I'll understand if you don't find this series of videos all that interesting. But if you are interested in trying to create Hawg Heaven, then watch on. So that's what I'm going to talk about today, is what process we would have to go through to actually create a scenario that was one in which the A-10A could really serve the purpose that it was designed for in DCS, with the limitations that DCS gives us. Now, so the first thing I want to talk about, most of this is about the environment that we're going to create. It's about the scenario, not about the aircraft or the weapons or any of that sort of stuff. So let me talk first about how I think this is going to be different than what most players might experience when they play on a normal multiplayer server. And bear in mind, I'm not criticizing multiplayer servers. I'm just explaining why that experience is not really like what a Cold War battlefield would have been like. Now, I'm not talking about servers that are run by squadrons that put a lot of time into planning these sorts of things. There may very well be groups out there that are very adept at simulating this. I'm talking about the average multiplayer server. So the first thing to realize is that the average multiplayer server is there to provide a really entertaining experience and challenging experience for solo players or maybe for small groups. And they're also there to allow the players to basically play their way. Players are using their preferred aircraft, they're using their preferred weapons, and their preferred tactics. The challenge on a multiplayer server is provided by that flexibility and that uncertainty. And what it's really doing is testing players' ability to react and use their aircraft at the edges of its envelope. Provides a dynamic situation that's constantly evolving, providing new challenges for the player. And I think a lot of these multiplayer servers do a very good job. They're popular. It's not the way I play DCS, but I know a lot of people who really, really enjoy that sort of thing. But none of that is actually a simulation of what it would have been like to fly as a pilot of an A-10 if the Warsaw Pact had invaded in 1982. So what do I mean by that? What would, or at least what do I think it would have been like for frontline pilots in 1982? So we discussed a little bit about that the last time in terms of what the threat would have been that they faced and what the job that they would have been expected to do. But in terms of the environment, what it was like when they climbed in the cockpit, let's contrast that to what you see in say, a multiplayer server. First of all, when you got in the cockpit, the overall enemy strategy and tactics were well understood. You knew what you'd be going out and facing. We talked about that in the last episode. Pilots also would have been based at a particular airbase. They would have had an area of operations they were expected to be familiar with. They would have been expected to be able to find their way around it without using a map, and they would have known very prominent landmarks. They basically would have been very familiar with it. They would have flown there all the time, and they would have known which direction the enemy was going to come from, possible axes of advance. They would have planned all of that ahead of time. None of that would have been a surprise. They would have flown as part of a squadron. The squadrons would have had standard weapons loadouts, and the employment of those weapons would be standardized. There would be no making it up as you go along. In short, the whole system was designed not to deliver any surprises, not to provide uncertainty, because the challenge was going to come from the overwhelming numerical superiority of the enemy. Now, the enemy is not invincible individually, but they very well may be unstoppable en masse, which means that success is going to be based on the kill ratio. not on your ability to adapt to a changing situation. The challenge for a pilot is, can they do enough damage before he or his aircraft is removed from the battle? And can he even use his weapons efficiently enough not to run out of them before NATO is overrun? So that challenge is going to be quite different than, say, spawning into a multiplayer server where you get to define a lot of those things yourself, and where the challenge is going to come from the situations that are thrown at you in that environment. The other thing that's really different about the way pilots would have flown was that there was no such thing as solo play. The entire system was based on very defined and very intricate teamwork. Every pilot would have been part of an element, a flight, and a squadron, and a wing. And that was also part of a larger air and ground plan, and that was all designed to work together. And that plan would have told the pilot when he was going to fly, where he was going to fly, where he would be allowed to engage targets, and probably the weapons that he would be using would also have been decided ahead of time. None of that would have happened in the cockpit. Now, the weapons would be employed using tactics that had been defined and practiced often ahead of time. Those tactics would have emphasized mutual support and teamwork with his element, either his lead or his wingman, and also with his flight. Those tactics also probably would have put a priority on survivability because, as I said before, kill ratio is king. So high-risk strategies are going to be discouraged. No one wants to go into this and make it a fair fight. Pilots want to be launched into situations where they have the greatest chance of success, and pilots will be patient and careful, and they'll only take calculated risk that they think can be managed. And it's like the old saying, there are old fighter pilots and bold fighter pilots. There are no old and bold fighter pilots. So, to summarize in DCS terms, if you were to fly in such a scenario, this is what you would see. You would launch into a target-rich environment. You would know where to find your targets. You wouldn't have to search very hard for them. It will be terrain that you're very familiar with, that you've flown over many times before. Before you get into the cockpit, you'll have a plan. You'll have studied that plan beforehand, and it will involve a lot of teamwork. You will have discussed it with your teammates before you start up. When you fly, you will be faced with a huge number of vehicles, and there will be a lot going on around you besides trying to take out your target. You will need to minimize casualties and minimize risk while maximizing damage to the enemy. That's how you will win the scenario, and that's what your challenge will be. Or at least that's what I would like your challenge to be in this scenario. So, how are we going to do that working with what DCS gives us? So let's take a look at how we set that up. I mean, first of all, knowing what to put on the map, the vehicles and the table of organization and equipment is well documented for Warsaw Pact forces, and most of those vehicles are available in DCS, and that should be fairly easy. We also need to find a suitable place for the engagement. It needs to be kind of hilly, what I would call parkland, villages interspersed with small stands of woods. There have to be some obvious axes of advance. It would be nice if it had a river as a main line of defense. That would be a bonus. So we picked an area here. This is where the scenario is going to take place. It's up on the northeast corner of the Caucasus map. So the next thing we have to do once we figured out where to place the scenario is, how do we simulate a ground engagement? After all, this is really a scenario about ground forces engaging one another with air support. So we do have to get the ground part of it right. The problem in DCS is that fights between ground units just don't work. Ground units can't dig in, and they are also just way too lethal. In general, what I would say about the AI in DCS, at least the ground units AI, is that the AI is what I would say call omniscient and decisive. In other words, the AI can see everything, and it is able to make clear and rapid decisions without any confusion. Now, both of these things are entirely atypical of anyone who's actually engaged in ground combat. Confusion reigns, things are chaotic, you don't know everything that is happening, and you're faced with constant decisions, and you don't always make the right one. Well, that's not how the AI behaves, so we're going to have to do something about that. The fact of the matter is, if you put even two sizable ground forces in lethal range of one another, you'll be lucky if the engagement lasts 30 seconds, which is obviously not the way that it would go in real life. So I think that it's probably not possible to actually just straight up simulate a Warsaw Pact attack on NATO forces. I think we're going to have to kind of simulate the ground combat effects in the background and see what it would look like from the air without actually just allowing the ground units to just fire at one another. I've tried a bunch of different ways of doing it, and it just doesn't work. Now, the same problem, we're going to have the same problem when we take a look at AI air defenses. We're going to have to be fairly careful and see if there's some things that we need to script. And now, again, in DCS, the weapons are well modeled, but the behavior just isn't. Because, again, AI air defense weapons are omniscient and they're decisive. They know everything that's happening. They know where all aircraft are at all times. They're not even confused by trees or buildings or smoke or fog. And they also make very rapid decisions, and those decisions are almost always the right ones. They're never confused. They're never surprised. They're never overwhelmed. And since a lot of tactics that are used against air defense are designed to confuse, surprise, or overwhelm them, none of those tactics work properly in DCS using the AI air defenses, which is too bad. So we don't want to change the tactics to adapt to the AI units. We want to try and use the tactics that were expected to work. Somehow we have to adapt the AI's behavior to make them less omniscient, less decisive, and we'll talk about that as we go on. But that's one thing that we're just going to have to be on the lookout for. One of the things that we certainly will do is restrict most ground units to fire only at ground targets. The idea that the commander of a BTR or T-72 would be driving in column of route, half out of his turret with, manning his anti-aircraft machine gun, looking for NATO aircraft in that kind of lethal environment is just it's just not credible as far as I'm concerned. So Warsaw Pact ground units, other than dedicated air defense units or other than units that have been posted as air sentries, should just not fire at aircraft, because I don't think they would have. And again, so you take a tank commander who apparently can see aircraft kilometers away through trees and make sure that he knows exactly where they're coming from and exactly how to shoot at them. It's just not a situation that would have happened. And so you end up using tactics that would just not be appropriate to the real situation. So that's one thing that we're going to need to take care of. Another thing that I think need to simulate is we need to simulate suppression of enemy air defenses. And that wasn't the job of the A-10. So we don't want A-10s going out and engaging long-range SAMs like the SA-6 or the SA-2. That wasn't the job they were supposed to do. Now, they can't operate in an environment where those units are operating, though. So what do? Well, I think we have to expect that those kinds of air defenses would have been suppressed at a higher level by the Wild Weasels and by the Ravens. And they may not have been eliminated, but they certainly would have been made less effective. And by that I mean they probably would have not been able to move as quickly forward, so the leading elements would have kind of outrun the SAM umbrella. Plus, a lot of the SAMs would have been preoccupied dealing with the Wild Weasels or the Ravens, which were actually a threat to them. So while they would be there, they shouldn't prohibit the A-10s from being able to do their job, particularly so long as the A-10s are not operating in too much depth behind the front line. So that's what we'll try and model in this scenario. The other thing that we have to do with the AI is really force it to follow Warsaw Pact doctrine. We need to organize the units according to the Warsaw Pact organizational diagrams, and the units need to operate and react according to that doctrine, which means that that's fairly easy in the first scenario where we're just modeling the advance, because it basically means that those vehicles are going to stay in column of route almost regardless of what happens to them. Remember, the Soviets emphasized at all levels that you were not to react to the threat unless it became overwhelming. There was not to be any dispersal, no delay, drive through any threat that you found. So that is how the Warsaw Pact forces are going to behave. It's not going to be all that surprising, but it's not supposed to be. The Warsaw Pact was not trying to hide its tactics from NATO. Any NATO pilot would have known how he would have expected ground forces to behave in an invasion. The other thing that we really have to do is make sure that when we plan the scenario, that we include the follow-on echelons, not just the lead echelons that are countering friendly ground troops, because, of course, that's what our targets are going to be. So we need to have the forward echelons there to see them. We need to simulate their engagement with friendly forces, but the targets that we're going to be after are the regimental headquarters and the follow-on battalions. So that's what we're going to actually focus on simulating in the scenario. So if you were a player who came out and flew that scenario, what would it be like? What would you need to know? So, well, we're practicing a little. That is, a group of players from my Discord channel and I have been trying to put together this scenario and try it out. And we've discovered a few things that you need to know if you're going to fly in this environment, 1982 Warsaw Pact invasion environment. The first thing that we have discovered is that you really do need to practice, because you need to fly with a group and you need to get at least proficient at basic formation flying. Not sort of tight air show formations or anything, but formations that keep you in contact with your wingman and your element lead. You simply can't fly alone, and you have to learn how to fly together. You also need to fly over the ground that you're going to fight on. You need to be able to quickly identify landmarks and use them to alert other players to contacts, particularly high priority ones like SAM, launches, or AAA. And there's no point in trying to give bra references from the bullseye for something like that. You just don't have time to calculate it, and nobody you say it to is going to have time to figure it out. You have to be able to point to things on the ground using prominent landmarks. So when you say the big field, everybody knows what you mean because you've agreed on it ahead of time. You also need to develop team tactics. I mean, the only way to stay safe is to look out for one another. Your head cannot be in your cockpit and worried about your aircraft. You have to be worried about your teammates. And you need to be coordinated. There needs to be a plan, and there needs to be a mission commander that implements the plan. And you need to be able to observe the area of operations and build situational awareness. This is because it's just too complicated a situation with all sorts of things happening and only very specific things that you're supposed to do. There are limits on where you can engage targets and what targets you can engage. You have to spend time figuring out where the enemy is, where the air defenses are, and making a plan. And this is where the Hawg really shines. Its slow speed and long loiter time mean that you have time to build that situational awareness, and you're also flying slow and controlled enough to be able to spend time finding the enemy units, identifying the highest priority ones, and understanding how the terrain is going to play into your ingress and egress routes, because you really have to use the ground. It's not enough to fly low. You have to get terrain between you and the threat. You have to know where the threat is, and you have to know how the terrain lies. And again, this is where the Hawg really excels, both because it's great at flying close to the ground, but also because it gives you time to pick a route and to follow it. And other aircraft aren't as good at that as the Hawg is, really not. You also need to expect to be making many passes on the enemy. You need to find the priority targets like air defense units. You You need to pick them off. If you get into a high threat environment, you need to abort the attack, go back and try again. You have to try and get the air defense units with standoff weapons like the Mavericks if you can. And then you need to use your area weapons to take out large numbers of vehicles. And finally, you need to go in with the gun. Again, all of this is where the Hawg really stands out. There really isn't another aircraft that can achieve the kill ratio that the Hawg can. And remember, kill ratio is king in this scenario. So, this is why I'm finding that actually, planning this scenario this way, without really meaning to, I have suddenly discovered what the Hawg is good at. And I realize why it was designed with a lot of these things in mind. And I knew those things before, but it wasn't obvious until we started flying in this scenario. So I've really been excited by that, by finding out that the Hawg is actually the aircraft I want to be flying in this scenario. So we've been learning a lot about how to fly in this scenario, how to use the Hawg. We're developing some plans and some tactics, but we're not all the way there yet. My goal eventually is to run some events where we play the scenario with up to 8 players. Players will come in, the scenario will be pre-planned, so will the actual operations plan, and there'll be a mission commander, and you will fly as part of a team. It may mean that you have to do a little practicing before you start. That's where I'd like to get to with this, and obviously I want to make some videos about that experience. We're not ready to do that yet, but if you want to participate in the process, certainly are welcome to drop by my Discord, look for the thread called The Balloon Goes Up, and join the team if you would like to. And that's going to be all for today, so thanks for listening. Talk to you again soon. Stay tuned for more, and this is going to be Sidekick signing off.